Retirement used to feel like the finish line. You worked for decades. You stayed responsible. You saved what you could. And eventually, work would end. Not because life became easy, but because the deal was clear. You give the system your strongest years. And later, the system gives some time back. That was the promise. Not luxury, not endless comfort. Just the ability to stop selling your time before your body and mind were completely spent. But that deal is collapsing because millions of people are starting to realize something terrifying. They may never actually retire. Not comfortably, not on time, maybe not at all. And once that possibility sinks in, work starts to feel different. It stops feeling like a path with an ending. It starts feeling like a tunnel that keeps extending. So, what changed? Did people stop planning? Did discipline disappear? Or did the economy quietly stop being built for retirement in the first place? Because if people are expected to work their entire lives just to remain afloat, then retirement is not simply getting harder. It is being transformed from a normal life stage into an increasingly fragile privilege. When people imagine retirement, they are not just imagining financial math. They are imagining release. Retirement means the end of economic dependence on your daily labor. It means time that belongs more to you. It means relief from constant scheduling, employer control, commuting, deadlines, and performance. That mattered deeply, because the modern work bargain was never only about income. It was about sequence. You work first, then later you live differently. Maybe more slowly, maybe more freely, maybe with less pressure. Retirement was the stage that made decades of labor feel finite. It told people that work would not consume all of life, that there would be a point at which the burden eased. And that idea did a lot of psychological work inside modern society. It made sacrifice feel bounded. It made discipline feel directional. It made work feel like a chapter instead of a permanent condition. Once retirement starts disappearing, all of that changes, because then the question becomes much darker. If work no longer ends, what exactly were people enduring it for? One reason this feels confusing is that many people still think retirement is simply the natural result of responsibility. It isn't. Retirement was never just a moral reward for good behavior. It depended on institutions, it depended on pensions, on stronger wage growth, on more stable employment, on lower housing burdens for many workers later in life, on social systems that absorbed more old age risk, on a labor market where staying in one place long enough to build security was more plausible. In other words, retirement worked best when society still helped make it work. That is the part people forget. The idea of work hard, save, and retire sounds individual, but it only functions at scale when the structure underneath it is still intact. Once that structure weakens, personal discipline alone becomes less powerful. A person can be responsible and still lose, because the problem is no longer only whether they tried. It is whether the system still converts effort into later life stability the way it once did. For a growing number of workers, it doesn't. One of the biggest shifts in modern economic life is that institutions gave workers more responsibility while giving them less protection. That is especially true in retirement. In older models, employers and public systems often carried more of the long-term burden. Now, much more of that burden sits with the individual. You manage the savings, you manage the risk, you manage the timing, you manage the investments, you manage the uncertainty, you manage the possibility that none of it will be enough. This sounds empowering in theory. In practice, it is terrifying, because most workers do not control the variables that determine whether retirement is realistic. They do not control wage growth. They do not control housing inflation. They do not control healthcare costs. They do not control market timing. They do not control layoffs. And yet they are told to behave as though the outcome depends mostly on their planning. That is a profound shift. The system did not eliminate retirement risk. It privatized it. And once risk moves downward like that, retirement stops feeling like a social expectation and starts feeling like a personal gamble. That is a very different kind of future. There is another reason retirement feels farther away now. The labor system itself became worse at producing continuity. Jobs became more unstable. Careers became more fragmented. Benefits weakened. Layoffs became more normalized. Gig and contract work expanded. People moved more. Wages often struggled to keep pace with the cost of life. That makes retirement planning much harder than cultural narratives admit. Because retirement security does not come from one good year. It comes from continuity over decades. And continuity is exactly what many workers no longer have. You cannot build long-range stability easily inside permanent volatility. Every interruption matters. Every underpaid stretch matters. Every period without benefits matters. Every financial shock matters. Every restart matters. Just save consistently. Muffled older voice. So when older advice says, just save consistently, it often ignores something central. Consistent saving requires a level of consistent life structure that many modern workers do not actually possess. That is why so many people feel behind. Not because they are uniquely irresponsible, but because they are trying to build a long-term future inside an economic environment optimized for short-term instability. Even if workers manage to save something, another problem keeps growing in the background. Retirement got more expensive. Not just because prices rise in general, but because aging itself now carries heavier financial pressure. Housing remains expensive. Healthcare can become overwhelming. Longer lifespans change the amount of money people feel they need. This changes the emotional meaning of enough. Enough becomes harder to define, harder to trust, harder to reach. And once people stop believing they can ever have enough, retirement starts to feel less like a plan and more like a fantasy they are afraid to examine too closely. That fear matters, because many people are not only worried about retiring, they are worried about becoming old and economically exposed. That is a different kind of fear. It is not about luxury, it is about dependency, about needing rest and not being able to afford it, about being tired and still needing to work, about your body slowing down before your bills do. That is one of the most quietly devastating realities in the modern economy. This is where the subject becomes even more uncomfortable. Retirement is increasingly less universal and more stratified. For some people, it remains plausible. For others, it is drifting out of reach. That means retirement is slowly changing from a common expectation into a class marker. A sign that someone had enough stability, enough income, enough asset access, enough protection, enough luck, or enough institutional support to exit work before work finished consuming them. That matters because it changes the moral meaning of labor. If only certain workers can actually retire, then the system is no longer offering the same ending to everyone who participates in it. Some get decades of delayed freedom. Others get prolonged survival inside work until illness, exhaustion, or age forces an exit on harsher terms. That is not just inequality of income, it is inequality of life structure, inequality of time, of rest, of physical relief, of when or whether a person gets to stop. Once you see it that way, retirement looks less like a personal milestone and more like one of the clearest measures of who the economy was really built to protect. The lesson here is not that saving does not matter. It does. But telling workers simply to save more misses the scale of the structural shift. The deeper issue is that the economy kept many of the old expectations while quietly removing many of the old supports. People are still told to prepare for retirement, still told to be responsible, still told to think long-term. But they are doing that inside a system with weaker guarantees, more volatility, heavier costs, and more individualized risk. That is why so many people feel both guilty and trapped. They are measured by a standard built for a world that is fading. And because the language around retirement has not fully caught up, workers keep experiencing a structural problem as a personal shortcoming. But the real question is bigger than any one person's savings rate. What does it mean when an entire work culture still demands discipline while becoming less and less capable of funding the final reward that discipline was supposed to buy? That is the question underneath this entire crisis, and it is not really about spreadsheets. It is about whether modern work still leads anywhere that feels human. Maybe that is why the idea of never retiring hits so hard. Because it is not just about money, it is about the disappearance of an ending. The disappearance of the moment when work stops dominating time. The disappearance of the stage of life that told people their labor had limits. The disappearance of the promise that if you kept going long enough, someday you could finally stop. So yes, many people may never retire in the way earlier generations imagined, not because they all failed, not because discipline became meaningless, but because the system became worse at turning work into later life security, while asking individuals to absorb more and more of the burden themselves. And once that happens, retirement does not vanish all at once. It fades. From expectation to aspiration to privilege. And that may be one of the clearest signs that the modern labor bargain is breaking at its final stage.